Back in October of 2019, I was working as a sales rep for a company that supplied equipment to small businesses. I spent a lot of time on the road back then. Most weeks I'd be driving through multiple towns, meeting customers, eating whatever was available near the highway, and staying in cheap hotels or motels. This happened during a trip through Oklahoma. I'd spent most of the day meeting clients around Tulsa. My next appointment was the following morning, a little over an hour away, so I decided to stop for the night instead of making the drive. I remember it being early October because it was still warm during the day. Once the sun went down, though, it cooled off pretty fast. The motel I found was right off the highway outside Tulsa. It was one of those older places where every room door opens directly to the parking lot. It wasn't anything special, but it looked decent enough for one night. I checked in around 6. The woman at the front desk gave me a key card and told me I was in room 214. It was near the end of the second floor walkway. There weren't many people there, maybe 8 or 9 vehicles in the lot. After dropping my bags off, I headed out to get dinner. As I walked back toward my car, I noticed a pickup truck parked near the edge of the property. There was a guy sitting inside. I couldn't really make out much about him. He was just sitting there. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I drove to a diner a few miles away, ordered a burger and fries, watched part of a baseball game on a TV behind the counter, and eventually headed back. When I got back to the motel, I noticed something under my door. It was a folded brochure. I picked it up, unlocked the room, and tossed it on the desk. I figured someone from the motel had left it there while I was gone. A little later, I opened it. It was blank. There wasn't a map, advertisements, rules, or anything else inside. Just folded sheets of blank paper. I looked at it for a few seconds and threw it away. I figured maybe somebody had grabbed the wrong stack from a printer. That seemed more likely than anything else. Around 10 that night, I was answering emails from bed when I heard footsteps outside. That wasn't unusual. People were still arriving. The footsteps stopped outside my room. I expected a knock. Nothing happened. Whoever it was stood there for several seconds. Then the footsteps continued down the walkway. I assumed somebody had the wrong room number. A few minutes later, I stopped thinking about it and eventually went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up around 7. I showered, packed my things, and started carrying bags down to my car. While walking back for another load, I happened to notice a cigarette butt below my window. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention. The reason it stood out was because my room was at the end of the building. There wasn't much reason for people to be standing there. I don't smoke either. Still, it could have been anybody. Someone walking by, someone making a phone call. There were plenty of explanations. I loaded the rest of my stuff into the trunk and got ready to leave. Then I noticed the pickup truck again. It was still there. The guy had moved to a different spot in the lot. Now the truck was parked closer to the building. What caught my attention was that it was facing almost directly toward my room. I looked at it for a second and then got into my car. A few moments later, I remembered I'd forgotten my phone charger. It was still plugged into the wall. So I got out and headed back upstairs. When I opened the room, everything looked normal. Then I noticed the bathroom door. It was shut. I was pretty sure I'd left it open. Maybe that sounds minor. Maybe it is. But I'd been moving between the bathroom and the main room while packing, and I remembered leaving it open. Now it was closed. I stood there trying to remember if I'd shut it without realizing. Maybe I had. I don't know. I checked the room anyway. Nothing seemed out of place. My laptop was there. My suitcase was there. Nothing appeared to be missing. The charger was still plugged into the wall where I'd left it. I grabbed it and left. As I came around the side of the building, I looked toward a maintenance shed behind the motel. A man walked out of it. I couldn't get a good look at him. He headed across the back of the property toward the pickup truck. A few seconds later, the truck started moving. It pulled out and headed toward the highway. The whole thing happened pretty quickly, maybe 20 seconds. I stood there watching for a moment. Maybe the guy worked there, maybe he was doing maintenance, maybe none of it was connected. Before leaving, I stopped at the front desk. I told them about the brochure, the footsteps outside my room, and the bathroom door. The employee seemed confused. She had someone else come look at the room with us. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. The locks were fine. The windows were closed. As far as they could tell, nobody had been inside. After that, I left and continued my trip. For a while, I didn't think much about it. Then, every so often, I'd remember one of the details, mostly the brochure. I've never understood that part. If it came from the motel, why was it blank? If another guest left it there, why my room? Maybe there's a simple explanation for all of it. The truck, the footsteps, the cigarette butt, the bathroom door. I've thought about each thing separately. What bothers me is how they all happened during a single night when I was only there for a few hours. Nothing was stolen, nobody approached me, nothing directly happened. Still, whenever I think about that motel outside Tulsa, I end up wondering whether someone got into room 214 while I was gone. And if they did, what they were actually doing in there. This happened in January of 2021, about 6 months after my divorce. My son was 8 at the time, and I decided to drive from Kentucky to eastern Tennessee to visit some relatives. We planned to stay a few days and then head home before he had to go back to school. The drive was pretty normal. I remember stopping at a Cracker Barrel because my son wanted pancakes, even though it was already mid-afternoon. It was cold out and overcast all day. By the time we got near my relative's town, it was getting dark. Their house was already packed with family, so I figured it would be easier to get a motel nearby instead of trying to fit 2 more people into the house. The motel was along a 2-lane road outside town. It looked a little older than the photos online, but it seemed fine. We checked in around 6. Our room was on the ground floor, facing the parking lot. There was an ice machine near the middle of the property and a couple vending machines beside it. You could see both from our window. After bringing our bags inside, I started unpacking while my son watched TV. That's when I first noticed the guy. He was standing by the ice machine. The only reason I paid attention was because he seemed to stay there for a while. He filled a bucket, dumped the ice out, then started over. I remember thinking maybe the machine wasn't working right. I went back to unpacking. A little while later, I happened to look outside again. He was still there. Not doing much, just hanging around the ice machine. I didn't think much of it. People do weird things when they're bored. Later that evening, my son and I walked over to get snacks from the vending machines. The same guy was standing nearby. When I looked in his direction, he turned away and started looking at one of the machines. I figured he was another guest. We got our snacks and went back to the room. Around 9, I took a shower while my son stayed inside watching TV. When I came back out, he was sitting on the bed playing a game. Without looking up, he said, "That ice machine guy was outside." I asked what he meant. He walked by the window. I asked if he did anything else. My son said no. Kids notice random things, so I didn't think much about it. A few hours later, after my son was asleep, I was sitting in bed reading. Before going to sleep, I got up to close the curtains completely. I looked outside first. The guy was sitting on a bench across the parking lot. It was cold enough that most people weren't spending time outside unless they had a reason. The bench faced toward our section of rooms. Maybe he was smoking. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I don't know. I closed the curtains and went to bed. The next morning, my son and I left to get breakfast before meeting family. As we were walking to the car, I noticed muddy footprints below our window. The ground was still wet from rain earlier that week. The footprints came from the parking lot, stopped beneath the window, then went back the same way. That could have meant almost anything. Somebody could have been walking around. Somebody could have stopped to make a phone call. I looked at them for a few seconds, then got in the car. The rest of the day was normal. We spent time with relatives and came back to the motel that evening. After dinner, my son was watching television while I sat on the bed reading. The room was quiet. A few minutes later, the phone rang. I answered it. A man said there had been a noise complaint about our room. I apologized because I assumed maybe the TV had been too loud. He told me to keep the noise down. Then he hung up. The call lasted maybe 15 seconds. I turned the TV volume down and went back to reading. A few minutes later, I started thinking about the call. The guy never said he was from the front desk. That stood out because every motel call I'd ever gotten started with something like, "This is the front desk." So I picked up the room phone and called the office. A woman answered. I said, "I got a noise complaint." There was a pause. Then she said, "From who?" I explained the call. She told me nobody from the office had called our room. There hadn't been any complaints either. At first I thought maybe there had been a mix-up with room numbers. I explained everything again. She repeated that nobody from the motel had called. That was pretty much the entire conversation. I hung up and walked over to the window. I pulled the curtain back slightly. The ice machine was visible from our room. So was the guy. He was standing next to it. Not getting ice. Not carrying anything. Just standing there, facing our room. I let the curtain close and started packing. I didn't tell my son much. I just said we were leaving. He asked why. I told him I'd explain later. Within 10 minutes, we were in the car. I drove to a larger hotel in a nearby town and rented another room. We stayed there for the rest of the trip. The next day, a couple relatives helped me go back and collect the things we'd left behind when we packed in a hurry. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been touched. I never stayed at that motel again. The thing that sticks with me isn't really the guy himself. It's the phone call. The employee sounded genuinely confused when I called back. If somebody else made that call, they somehow knew our room number. They knew where we were staying, and they knew enough to make it sound like a routine motel complaint. Maybe there's a normal explanation. I don't know what it is. What I do know is that the same guy kept showing up near our room. My son noticed him too, and somebody called pretending to be motel staff. I decided I wasn't interested in finding out what happened next. A few years ago, I spent about a week in western Pennsylvania for a utility project. My company had work in a small town out in a valley. There were a lot of old industrial buildings around the area that had been sitting empty for years. I was 35 and traveling alone. The job wasn't particularly interesting. Most days started early and ended around dinner. After work, I'd usually grab food somewhere, watch TV for a bit, and go to sleep. The motel I booked was one of the few places close to the job site. It was outside town along a quiet road. There were only 2 floors and maybe 20 rooms altogether. I checked in on a Sunday afternoon in late November. It was cold out. I remember stopping at a gas station before checking in and grabbing a sandwich because most of the restaurants nearby closed pretty early. My room was on the first floor near the back of the building. That first night was completely normal. I unpacked, watched some football, and went to bed around 10. Sometime during the night, I woke up because of a noise overhead. At first, I wasn't even sure what had woken me up. Then I heard it again. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor above me. The noise lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped. I checked my phone. It was a little after 2 in the morning. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to the woman working the front desk while I was getting coffee. She checked her computer and told me the room above mine wasn't occupied. I asked if she was sure. She said nobody had rented it recently. I figured maybe the sound came from another room. Older buildings can be noisy. I didn't think much more about it. The next night, I heard movement again. This time it sounded more like footsteps. Just somebody walking around. Back and forth. The noises came and went between 1 and 3 in the morning. The same thing happened the following night. And the night after that. I thought about asking for another room, but I was barely spending any time there besides sleeping. By the 4th day, I started paying more attention to the property. One thing I noticed was a staircase behind the motel. It went straight up to the 2nd floor walkway. What stood out was that you couldn't really see it from the office. Unless you walked around the side of the building, you'd probably miss it. At the time, it didn't seem important. I just happened to notice it. The next evening, work wrapped up early. I got back before dark. As I was parking, I glanced up at the room above mine. I saw a light move behind the curtains. It wasn't a lamp. It looked more like a flashlight. The light moved for a few seconds and then disappeared. I stood there looking at the window for a moment. Nothing else happened. Later on, I almost mentioned it at the front desk. I ended up not saying anything. I wasn't completely sure what I'd seen. The next morning, I ran into one of the housekeeping employees outside. I asked whether the room above mine was occupied. She shook her head. No, it's out of service. I asked how long it had been out of service. She said several weeks. Then she told me nobody had cleaned it during that time. I remember thinking about that for most of the day. That night, the footsteps came back. By then, I'd heard activity up there for 4 nights. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep. I got dressed and went outside. The parking lot was mostly empty. I walked to a spot where I could see the 2nd floor walkway. Then I waited. Nothing happened for a while. I was actually about to head back inside when the door above me opened. A man came out carrying a duffel bag. He pulled the door shut behind him. A few seconds later, another guy came up from the direction of the back staircase. The 2 of them stopped and talked briefly. I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then they started walking toward the far side of the property. Neither one looked in my direction. At least I don't remember them looking over. I went back to my room and locked the door. At that point, I was pretty sure somebody had been using the room. Whether they were squatters or something else, I had no idea. I sat on the bed for a few minutes trying to decide whether I should call the police right then or just wait until morning. While I was sitting there, I heard my door handle move. Just once. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, it moved again. A little longer that time. Then nothing. I walked over and checked through the peephole. The walkway was empty. Whoever touched the handle was gone. I didn't get much sleep after that. The next morning, I reported everything to local police before heading to work. Later that day, officers went to the motel. I wasn't there when they checked the room. I only heard about it afterward. According to what I was told, they found evidence that multiple people had been staying there without permission. That's about all I ever learned. Nobody told me who they were. Nobody told me why they were there. The next day, I checked out and moved to a hotel closer to town. I've stayed in a lot of motels for work over the years. Before that trip and after it. But ever since then, I've avoided isolated roadside motels whenever I can. The part I still think about isn't finding out people were staying in the room. That at least explained the noises. What I never figured out was the timing. I watched those two guys leave. I went straight back to my room. Then somebody tried my door handle a few minutes later. As far as I know, neither of those men noticed me outside. There wasn't any obvious reason they should have known I'd seen them. Maybe there was someone else using the room too. Maybe there was another explanation. I don't know. Nobody ever gave me one.